Good morning, everybody. Corey Hughes Bloody History. So, today, I'm going to tell you a story. It's an interesting story. It's a fascinating story. It's a who the hell knows if it's true kind of story. And just like all stories like that, there is always a kernel of truth. Today, we're going to talk about Lee Harvey Oswald, a man named Stephen Landesberg. And this is an article written by Stan Weber. This document comes from the John Armstrong collection at Baylor University, and I have to make everybody aware of something. Baylor University's cover page for John Armstrong's collection is now gone. Meaning, I used to have a link that I would click, and it would bring me directly to the John Armstrong collection, and it had a very nice cover page, and it had some explanation of what the files were, and all that stuff. But guess what? When you go to that link now, it's dead. So what I did was I went into the Baylor University digital collections search, and all of John's files are still there. They're just no longer organized into a collection. So I've been frantically downloading files. I've probably got, let me see, I can tell you exactly how many pages, I can tell you exactly how many files he has. He has just over 2,000 files. Just over 2,000 individual files. And those files comprise somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 pages. I've probably downloaded 75 or 80 of them. Obviously looking for specific topics, right? I got all the Angleton stuff. I got all of the Oswald early life stuff. Well, I don't actually really need, I kind of skipped a lot of it because I don't need it. A lot of it I already had, and I don't need it for the next book. The next book, I needed all the Marines stuff, so I downloaded all of the Marines files, all of them. But the best thing is I have other resources for those files, too, outside of John's collection. So I'm going to throw this out there. If any of you out there are interested in research and understanding research and how to do research, I would very much like some assistance in gathering anything you can on Oswald in the Marines, no matter how small or random a reference. If you're interested in going through John's files, I will leave the link in the show notes for this episode. Please go through John's files, go through his Marine stuff, anything in the Marines that you're interested in. I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. Man, perhaps I'd even start like some sort of group for people who are interested in getting started in doing some real research. I have a dedicated research group with a very small, hand-picked group of members who I've found are invaluable to my research. So I think it might be warranted to start another group for people who are interested in getting started in doing research and learning how to do that. It could be pretty interesting. But this story we're going to tell today, I'm not, I'm not even going to preface it. I'm just going to hop right in. And if this story doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. So here we go. On the night of November 22nd, 1963, a man who identified himself as Jim Rizzuto called a New York City radio station to report that Lee Harvey Oswald had been seen in Greenwich Village in 1962 in the company of Steve Landis, a Nazi sympathizer and right-wing agitator from Wiggins, Mississippi. The FBI ultimately determined that Rizzuto's story was a hoax, and that Rizzuto's real name was Stephen Harris Landesberg. This paper will recite the story Landesberg told to the FBI and will consider the implications of that story, assuming it is true, for research on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The paper also explores, 1, the similarities in the political careers of Landesberg and Lee Oswald, and 2, the circumstantial resemblance between Stephen H. Landesberg and actor-comedian Steve Landesberg, a Bronx native who played Detective Arthur Dietrich in the Barney Miller TV series. When Jim Rizzuto called the radio station on assassination night, he claimed that he served in the Marine Corps with both Lee Oswald and Landis, a man whose pro-segregationist, anti-Semitic rhetoric disrupted Jewish gatherings and liberal rallies in Greenwich Village in 1961 and 62. Rizzuto stated during his call that he could find Landis and bring him to the station for an interview that weekend. The station was very much interested in talking to Rizzuto and arranged to speak with him at 3 a.m. on November 23rd. The station called in the FBI to observe the interview. When Rizzuto showed up, he told station officials in the FBI the same story that he had apparently already recited at several radio stations and newspaper offices on November 22nd. This information is summarized below. He met Steve Landis and Lee Oswald in the Marine Corps at Camp Lejeune in the summer of 1956. After his Marine service, he kept in touch with Landis, who sent postcards from Stockholm, Leningrad, and Moscow in 1960. Landis was accompanied in Europe and Russia by Lee Oswald by a man named Earl Perry, who in 1963 was living near El Paso, Texas. Rizzuto had heard, apparently from Landis, that Oswald was considering becoming a Russian citizen. However, Landis said in one of his cards that Oswald just liked to travel and wanted to see Europe. All right, let me pause real quick. A couple things to point out here. Summer of 1956, where was Lee Harvey Oswald? Well, based on what we know from Frank DiBenedetto, the real Lee Oswald was still in New Orleans working for Two Jags, okay? And then we know that in September, October of 1956, that Harvey Oswald was attending Arlington Heights, okay? So that is, hang on a second. What I'm trying to do is trying to see if any of this is possible in any way, shape, or form. So this person he's talking about is not Harvey Oswald, because Harvey Oswald, we can say with certainty, was at Arlington Heights High School that fall for 1 month from September to October, right? But then remember, we have the overlap, and I suspect that Oswald went to Warren Easton during that time, right? So we can put Oswald, I think, more than likely, the real Lee Oswald, still in New Orleans. Because he would have been, that would account for the overlap in the fall semester of those couple weeks in October, as per the letter that was sent to Arlington Heights with the transcript, which said that he attended there until October of 1956, starting September of 55, right? So that, and then that's reaffirmed in Oswald's Latin American radio broadcast, right? So I'm kind of, the only alternative to, the only way that this could ever possibly fit is if it's the real Lee Oswald, and during the summer of 56, he went to Camp Lejeune, but then obviously that would have all been covered up and all that stuff. And that would be contradicted by the fact that we have 2 enrollment forms for Oswald, which will be in my new book that I'm working on. Maybe I'll post a picture of that. But yeah, I'm having a real hard time with the timing here. A real hard time with the timing. Who was in possibly Camp Lejeune during the summer of 56? Well, possibly one of those other Oswalds, Clyde, Clifford, or Clayton. And if you're not familiar with Clyde, Clifford, or Clayton Oswald, you should go back and watch my 5.5-hour video on Harvey and Lee, because it's in there. But there were 3 other Oswalds going through the same course of action that Oswald did in 1956. And that would have been before Oswald even entered in October of 56. So that needs to be ironed out. All right, let me pick this up again. He met Steve Landis and Lee Oswald in the Marine Corps Camp Lejeune, summer of 1956. After his Marine service, he kept in touch with Landis, who sent postcards from Stockholm, Leningrad, and Moscow in 1960. Landis was accompanied in Europe and Russia by Lee Oswald and a man named Earl Perry, who in 1963 was living near El Paso, Texas. Rizzuto had heard, apparently from Landis, that Oswald was considering becoming a Russian citizen. However, Landis said in one of his cards that Oswald just liked to travel and wanted to see Europe. He next saw Landis in Miami, Florida, at the Hotel Tamiami, T-A-M, or probably Tamiami. Hotel Tamiami in 1961. Landis had been back home in Mississippi for a while, apparently visiting his hometown of Wiggins, as well as relatives who live in Copiah County in the Mississippi Delta southwest of Jackson. Rizzuto said that Landis was looking for hotel work in South Florida. Landis told him that Oswald was back in the States and he'd gone back to Texas. He and Landis got together in New York around October 1961. Landis said he was going to be at the Mark Lane rally in December of 1961. This was after he had appeared on the Barry Gray radio program. I don't know what's up with that number. It says 1961, but that doesn't really make any sense, does it? He stated that at the Lane rally, a girl who was working with Landis continually tried to disrupt the meeting, and eventually the police were called. Landis later told him that this heckling was done for the States' Rights Party. Rizzuto advised that Landis and Earl Perry had attended a rally of the American Jewish Congress at their headquarters in the early part of 1962, and had caused such a disturbance that someone struck Landis. He stated that Oswald was also at the meeting taking pictures of the incident. At least one photograph was going to be sent to a pro-fascist publication. It was implied that Oswald, who supposedly roomed with Landis on East 8th Street, condoned Landis' exploits. At about this time, Landis was staying at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York City with a man from Memphis named Regan, first name unknown, who was described as 35 to 40 years old, 6'4" tall, 250 pounds, with a big stomach, a heavy build, very gruff voice. Regan was working for an ultra-right-wing organization, and he had paid Landis. Okay, no, when I say Landis, it's a L''EANDES, right? L''EANDES, just to clarify. To get up at meetings in which civil rights problems were being discussed and caused disturbances. Rizzuto so what that behavior is called an agitator, or agitation is what they're doing. So this is, agitation is something that intelligence agencies utilize, like the Antifa stuff. That's agitation. Rizzuto last saw Landis on Tuesday, November 19th, 1963, at a bar on West 10th Street. Landis stated that Oswald and Perry were together in Texas, that Perry was working for an organization that had something to do with anti-Mexican propaganda. He said Perry would be well known as a member of a number of radical groups. Rizzuto left the station soon after the interview, leaving the phone number of a restaurant where he could be reached. The FBI, based on Rizzuto's tip, launched a massive manhunt in New York City for Steve Landis. The FBI finally determined on December 5th, 1963, that Stephen Harris Landesberg of 66 West 10th Street, Rizzuto, and Landis were all the same person. An inadvertent photograph taken at one of the meetings Landis disrupted was enough for the FBI to link Landesberg with his two aliases. In an interview with the FBI on December 5th, Landesberg said that the activities he had attributed to Landis in New York City were actually his own activities under the name of Stephen Yves Landis. He said that the information he supplied to the Bureau on November 22nd, presumably that pertained to Oswald and Perry, was furnished to him by someone else. Near the end of the interview, he began to stutter and become incoherent. He did not recant his allegations about Oswald or Perry, and it appears that the agents never asked about Oswald at all. Landesberg was charged with providing false information to the FBI and was committed by a federal judge, John Cannella, to 10 days of psychiatric observation at Bellevue. Okay, whenever they want to get rid of somebody, they put him in psych observation. So it seems like he was an agent who was spilling the beans, and so they put him in the psych ward. Happens a lot. A lot of people in this story. Landesberg, who served in the Marine Corps briefly in 1961, impersonated Rizzuto on November 22nd and 23rd in a New York accent, and also very convincingly portrayed the drawing Landis during 1961 and 62. Reporters at the Village Voice, familiar with Landis' exploits in the early 60s, could not figure out why Landesberg, whom Voice staffers believed was Jewish, would want to wreak havoc amongst Jews in Manhattan by posing as a bigot from Mississippi. Oh my God, I wonder. I fucking wonder. Oh, let me screenshot that. Nor could they explain why Landesberg held to the view that Oswald was a rightist when it was becoming clear as early as the night of the assassination that the official line from the government and the establishment press was going to be that Oswald was a communist. Landesberg's indication on November 22nd that Oswald had a history as a rightist is the sort of information only a privileged few would have possessed at that moment. Only Oswald's intelligence handlers, or someone in a tight group close to Oswald, would have been aware of his contacts with the right wing, his infiltration of Edwin Walker's group, or his spying upon Castro exiles in New Orleans and Dallas. Landesberg appeared to have comparable insider knowledge of Oswald. For example, his story to the FBI showed that he knew that Oswald enjoyed attending political meetings, that Oswald was interested in photography, and that he was apparently anxious for some reason to gain measure of fame by sending pictures to a political publication. Landesberg professed this detailed knowledge on assassination night, days before the minutiae of Oswald's life began to appear in the papers, and months before the so-called backyard photographs of Oswald were shown to the public. Unfortunately, Landesberg was locked into Bellevue and was not asked about what he knew about Oswald. The FBI was upset with him because the search for Steve Landis had tied up its local staff for a week. The Bureau made an example of Landesberg. If you provide the FBI with false information about the Kennedy assassination, you'll land in jail or the mental ward or both. Landesberg unquestionably committed a hoax in the sense that he impersonated two people. But what about the Oswald story? He had apparent inside information about Oswald's right-wing activities, information that was important because it went against the grain of the official evidence. But by the time Landesberg was arrested, it was too late. The FBI report of December 9 was on its way to be typeset. Even at this early date, investigatory doors were being slammed shut instead of opened. The FBI tragically lost an opportunity to interrogate an associate of Oswald who could have supplied information relevant to a conspiracy to kill the president. What Landesberg knew was simply one more important piece of evidence the FBI chose to ignore in the aftermath of the assassination. There were remarkable similarities between the political careers of Landesberg and Oswald. Both men created phony one-man organizations that fronted for a radical group. That's not really totally true. Both had taken to the radio airwaves to publicize their cause. Both staged hostile big city confrontations designed to provoke anger and fear and to attract attention from the media. Both may have been set up to take blame for the actions of others. Landesberg's methods were so similar to Oswald's that one suspects Landesberg, like Oswald, was a government agent. Beyond the similarity in names, comedian Steve Landesberg shares certain important characteristics with Stephen H. Landesberg. Both men spent a substantial part of their lives in New York City. Police and media records indicate that Stephen H. Landesberg lived in the East Village and was from Queens, where his family resided in 1963. Comic Landesberg was born in the Bronx and grew up there. Both were young. The Stephen H. Landesberg, apprehended on December 5th, 1963, was 23 years old. Comedian Landesberg, born November 23rd, 1936, was 27 years old on December 5th, 1963. Both play a Southern character well. Stephen H. Landesberg portrayed a Southern bigot convincingly enough to cause serious alarm among Jews in New York. Comic Landesberg portrays a softer, modernized version of the same character in his commercials and in his comedy routines. In one ad that appeared in Texas during the summer of 1993, Landesberg plugged the virtues of a dry cleaning franchise, play acting the role of a Southern football coach, complete with a very convincing drawl. You know, some of the things that are being written here just pop out in my mind. Like, in one ad that appears in Texas during the summer of 1993, Landesberg plugged the virtues of a dry cleaning franchise. Okay, so how many dry cleaning and how many washaterias do we have in the story? We got like a half a dozen of relevance, okay? And then he says, play acting the role of a Southern football coach. Who else in the story is a football coach? We got a couple of them, but right off the top of the head, Daniel Patrick Powers would go on to be a football coach after his weird intelligence-like activities with Oswald in the Marines. So when I see these things pop up, it strikes me as more than just random. Stephen Landesberg has consistently kept his full name a secret. His entry into Who's Who in America has changed very little since his first appearance in that publication in 1980. His 1993 entry is therefore representative. Landesberg, Steve, actor, born New York City, November 23rd, member of the New York Stickball Team comedy group, regular on TV series Bobby Darin Amusement Company, 1972 to 73, Paul Sand and Friends and Lovers, 1974-75, Barney Miller, 1976 to 1982. Guest appearances on TV shows include The Tonight Show. Office Care Nancy Geller, ICM 8899, Beverly Boulevard, West Hollywood, California. No middle initial is provided, and the year of birth is missing. His American Society of Composers, Artists, and Publishers, ASCAP, biography is nearly identical to the one above, except that his birthday is excluded. No biographical source on Steve Landesberg checked by this writer has ever provided a middle initial. Only through the diligent efforts of Tulsa researcher John Armstrong do we know that Landesberg's middle initial may be R, and if true, would appear to indicate that the comedian is not the hoaxer. What we do not know is what Mr. Landesberg did between 1954, when he would have graduated from DeWitt Clinton High in the Bronx, and the late 60s, when he began to appear at New York comedy clubs, such as the Bitter End and the Improvisation. Regardless of whether the man arrested on December 5th is now a famous person or not, the question assassination researchers will want answered has a familiar ring to it. What did Stephen Landesberg know about Lee Harvey Oswald, and when did he know it? As we attempt to answer this question, several possibilities for future research are suggested. First, interviews with some of the men who served in the Marines with Oswald at Biloxi might reveal whether Oswald and Landesberg were in Biloxi at the same time, and if the two men associated with one another. You know, that shouldn't be too hard for me to find, because I have a ton of those diaries. I don't think so, though. The name Landesberg does not pop off the page as someone who I read it in the diaries at all. So, if Stephen Landesberg's birthday is in fact September 24th, 1940, he would be about a year younger than Oswald. According to the FBI's interview with Landesberg's mother, Landesberg traveled the country by hitchhiking each summer between 1957 and 1960. So it is possible he traveled to Biloxi. Landesberg's Landis character could have been developed on the trip to Wiggins at a backwoods town 40 miles north of Biloxi. Wiggins was where Landis claimed to be from. There we go. God damn it. Am I psychic or what? Daniel Powers told the Warren Commission that Oswald often went out of town on weekend pass from Biloxi, presumably to visit his mother in New Orleans. Yeah, but he wasn't sure. He thought he went to Texas. He wasn't really positive. He didn't know shit. But he really didn't know for sure where Oswald went. Oh, there we go. He could have gone somewhere else. Did he go to Wiggins? Another possibility is that Oswald traveled to New Orleans to see Landesberg and not his relatives. Landesberg's use of aliases such as Yvette Landis and Frenchie display some familiarity with the culture so prominent in New Orleans. Still another scenario is that comedian Landesberg served in the Marine Corps and that his service career overlapped with Oswald's at Biloxi. Second, aside from the summer of 1957 and the Greenwich Village incident of January 1962, hold on a second. Here he's saying summer of 57, but in the beginning, if you'll remember, it was the summer of 56. Okay? So we have a discrepancy, and this just looks like an error, because he was originally talking about 56, and it's not possible in 56. Would it be possible in the summer of 1957? Well, where was Oswald in the summer of 57? In March of 57, he goes to Jacksonville, and then on May 3rd of 1957, he goes to Biloxi, and after Biloxi, it is June 18th when he gets out there. He leaves there June 19th. Oh, yes. Oswald goes on liberty for a couple weeks, and he doesn't have to be back in El Toro until the 9th of July. So he's got 3 weeks. 3 weeks from June 19th to July 8th, basically. Or it would be July 7th or 6th because he has to get across the country. There you go. There's your window of when Oswald could have been with him up at Camp Lejeune. He most certainly could have been at Camp Lejeune those 3 fucking weeks. God damn it. How did I not see this earlier? All right. Screenshot for later. All right. All right. Did Landesberg visit Oswald in Texas or in New Orleans during the period from the summer of 62 to the fall of 63? The final appearance of Steve Landis in Manhattan before the assassination was March 7th, 62, when he heckled Hubert Humphrey at a Democratic Party rally in the Village. He drops from sight after this incident, and his name does not appear in the papers again until he was being sought for questioning in the Oswald investigation. Where did he go and what did he do from March 1962 until November 1963? Well, Oswald's not back until June 10th, 11th, something like that of 62. So, God, see, that's 2 books away. All this stuff I plan to cover, the post-June 62 stuff, is going to be in that final book of my Oswald series, which probably ain't going to be for 2 more years. What are these notes you got here? I can't read them. Something about where's Landis from 51 to 54. I'll look into that later. Third, we have another second Oswald to account for and to explain. The Oswald who knew Landesberg in Greenwich Village in 1962 must have been an Oswald impersonator if the real Oswald was in Minsk at the time. One could also argue the opposite. The true Oswald returned early from Russia. He was in New York in 1961 and early 62, just as Landesberg claims. The Russians sent an imposter Oswald to the United States of June of 62, and the man Jack Ruby shot was not Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, so that's a jumble of nonsense here. Let me explain why. Okay, so whether or not the really Oswald went to Russia is... I used to rule it out. I no longer rule it out. It's a possibility because I have one picture that is just blowing me away that looks like the really Oswald in Russia. If it's really in Russia. It might not really be in Russia. It might be somewhere else and they say it's in Russia. We just don't fucking know. But it's at a time Oswald's supposed to be in Russia. And so here, the thing that he's not getting is that I don't buy for a split second the Russians didn't send nobody to us. They're just sitting back going, what are these stupid Americans doing? I have no doubts that's what they were doing. Because I'm convinced the reason they sent Marina back with Oswald was like, oh yeah, you're going to send a spy with us? Well, fuck you. We're going to send a spy with you. Haha. Almost an inside joke because they knew that she would be under lockdown from the minute she got there, right? So almost like a big fuck you to America. It's kind of hilarious. But the real Oswald, as far as I'm concerned, he fell off the fucking earth September 11th, 1959. He gets his photograph taken on, actually the 10th. Gets his photograph taken on September 10th. And then the 11th, he's out. And then we have some conflict in what Robert Oswald says about Lee. Because the story is Lee comes back for a couple days or a week or whatever, stays with his brother Robert, and then he goes off to Helsinki and then Moscow, right? But no, I've got 2 pieces of evidence, 2, that would indicate that Oswald, the Lee Harvey Oswald, the real one, got out of the Marines a lot sooner than that. So I don't know what's going on with that. It's hard to iron out because all we have are conflicting documents with no real rational explanation. And the speculation is kind of like weird, right? Like you'd think the really Oswald would be out of the picture and just out of the picture. But if I'm correct about him leaving the Marines earlier, possibly as early as July, then that would mean that Oswald had to bounce back from Fort Worth, where he would have been staying, back to Los Angeles to get the photograph taken, which doesn't... I mean, it's definitely possible, but we'll never be able to really know, unless I can find 2 or 3 more pieces of evidence corroborating Lee Oswald's long stay in Fort Worth. Oh, I didn't even tell you, because Robert Oswald said that Lee Oswald he got out of the Marines and stayed with him for a few months before he left to go to the Soviet Union. He said that. I have the document. It was in my video presentation that I did. And so, you see, all these little conflicting pieces, they're not errors. They need to be fit into a proper timeline, and that's the hard part. So yeah, his summation here of of which Oswald is back from where is a little off. But I understand what he's saying. But yeah, the guy who Jack Ruby shot was Harvey Oswald, who we have evidence is the same person going back to the photograph of the Bronx Zoo. Period. Okay, so it's not a fucking Russian. It's an American fucking operation, and these guys are brothers. That's the conclusions that I've come to. All right, so fourth, who is Earl Perry? He is a real individual. Is he a real individual or construction of Landesberg's mind? The FBI uncovered an Earl Perry from Monroe, Louisiana, who checked into the Roosevelt Hotel in New York City in September of 1961, about 4 months prior to Landis meeting with Reagan, but found no relationship between Perry and Oswald. If Perry's real, he was one of Oswald's closest associates. He traveled to Europe and Russia when Oswald did, and appeared with Oswald at the disruption of the American Jewish Congress, a meeting in 1962. He returned to Texas about the same time as Oswald, and according to Landesberg, associated with Oswald in Texas in November 1963. Where was he on November 22nd? Okay, all right. I'm going to reread this because I'm having trouble comprehending all this at once. If Perry is real, he was one of Oswald's closest associates. He traveled to Europe and Russia when Oswald did, and appeared with Oswald at the disruption of the American Jewish Congress meeting in 1962. Somebody needs to look into that. Jim, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the American Jewish Congress meeting in 1962, anything you can find on that would be great. He returned to Texas at about the same time as Oswald, and according to Landesberg, associated with Oswald in Texas in November 1963. Where was he on November the 22nd? That is fascinating. Fifth, is Stephen Landesberg a missing link in Dick Russell's hypothesis that a Nazi axis is the birthplace of the assassination conspiracy? That's hilarious. Nazi axis. Oh, fuck off. Missing from Russell's scenario is a direct linkage between Oswald and the fascists. Researchers have long been curious as to why an address for the American Nazi Party appears in Oswald's address book, because the Nazi Party was headquartered in Queens, New York, during the early 1960s. Landesberg emerges as a logical conduit between Oswald and the Nazis. This is like a completely perpendicular line of research. One I'm undoubtedly going to have to go down at one time. I guess it can wait until I get done with this fucking book on the Marines. It is a grand understatement to say that it is important for investigators in any future probe of the assassination to locate Stephen H. Landesberg and call him to testify. A bunch of endnotes here. We can skip all that. Jesus, how many endnotes you got? All right, looks like we got some handwritten notes here. DeWitt Clinton, 718, got a phone number. Looks like a library. Under that, it says Jack. I don't know what that means. Stephen Landis, 1951 to 54, graduated 1954. Rutgers, New Brunswick, New Jersey, 57 to 60. And September 62. Columbia, September 63. That's Stephen Landesberg. All right, this article was called Stephen H. Landesberg and the Greenwich Village Hoax. Is this the same thing? Yep, back to the endnotes. Let me see what else this file contains. Here's a letter, probably from John Armstrong, perhaps. Dear Stan, thanks for copying me the documents and clips you also sent Carol Hewitt. Carol Hewitt has some amazing communications with John Armstrong. She did some really good work, and no one has ever heard of her. I'll have to dig up some of her stuff to do a show on one day. As I wrote her, my own documentation is meager, but I'm willing to comment on what you guys can crank out. As I advised John Armstrong, this research data should be processed for publication. The information that I have received since my own little piece appeared in the fourth decade has given me a better understanding of the Landesberg case. But the new information reinforces my confidence in my central points that Landesberg was likely a New York Jew, and so his association with either Nazis or racists was one of interest, not conviction, that he was likely a legitimate informer, and that this story offers intriguing parallels with that of Lee Oswald. Landesberg, like Oswald, had to be involved in U.S. intelligence agencies. while your copies of the federal investigative reports seem to show Landesberg recanting his original story of an association with Oswald, and he seemed to admit that he alone was Leandus and Rizzuto, he persisted in suggesting that he was an agent of someone else, having previously identified Stephen Yves Leanders, himself according to the FBI, as a paid agitator. According to the New York Times, December 6, 1963, Landis tells the FBI that his repudiated information was supplied to him by someone else. The FBI report that he then lapsed into incoherence may be consistent with the nuttiness, but it also fits my suspicion that irrationality was a cover for leads that authorities didn't want to pursue. Most important, Stephen Harris Landesberg provides proof of close association with another Landis. Checking Landesberg's Social Security number appearing in the FBI's report against those generated by Hewitt's Social Security database search reveals the following in increased order of curiosity. No match with Stephen Landesberg, whose record originates in New York and shifts to various LA locations, consistent with the actor who is almost certainly the Landesberg in question. No exact match with any other known Landesberg name variation or alias. A near exact match, excepting the last digit, with Stephen Landis, whose death record identifies him as Joseph Wirsch, Wiersch, born 1900, died 1985. This is how they used to do it, ladies and gentlemen. They used to do identity transfer with dead people. But guess what? You can't do that anymore, can you? No, that's why they had to change, because he just got outed here by goddamn John Armstrong and his crew. The CIA or whoever, or naval intelligence, most likely naval intelligence, they just got outed by these fucking researchers in this highlighted paragraph as using the fucking Social Security records of dead people. Fuck you, intelligence. Jesus Christ. See, that's how they had to, that's by the time of all the shit in New Orleans, like the Clay Shaw using Clem Bertrand, right? That name Clem Bertrand was the real name of a real person, but it was also used by multiple other people. And the name Bertrand was also a distant family name connected to Clay Shaw, right? So that's kind of how they do it, you know? They share aliases of real people. And when they go to interview the real person, they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. And they don't. That's the best part. It was identity theft, willing identity theft is kind of how it was. The young Landesberg cannot be the much older Landis Wirsch, but an 8-digit match cannot be mere coincidence. The match is one typo away from a perfect match, but I believe the aberrant last digit is actually a marker or code. Its last digit placement does not interfere with a database search, which normally would compare digits proceeding from left to right. That strategy allowed me to make the match in about 30 seconds. As library users know, codes logically run left to right from more general to more specific. Modifying the Social Security number with a 1-digit code would allow code readers to distinguish the different individuals with the same or similar Social Security numbers and names. If we make the normal assumption, with Landesberg himself supplied the FBI with the modified Wirsch-Landis Social Security number, then it follows that he was monitoring and perhaps posing as other Landis for those who couldn't distinguish the two or more Landis. This confirms my suspicion laid out in my letters to Carol Hewitt copied to you that the New Yorker college boy Stephen H. Landis, having dropped the German Jewish Berg from his name, was tailing the middle-aged immigrant using the Stephen Landis alias. Because he used an alias and likely emigrated from territories of the former Nazi regime in the mid-1950s, Landis Wirsch might seem a legitimate target of surveillance. Interestingly, the FBI documents Landesberg apparently shortened his last name by 1957 within the 1955 to 58 period that the older Stephen Landis goes on record with Social Security. Did you hear what I just said? The use of another Social Security number also suggests that Landesberg's surveillance was not freelance. Social Security numbers were more tightly held in 1963, but the U.S. intelligence security agencies could easily access Social Security numbers, and they would have the sophistication to recode them. And the FBI did use Social Security numbers for identification purposes because they include it in their identification of Landesberg if they checked out that ID. they would find that their interviewee continued to give false but revealing information, casting doubt on his overt recantation. This means that the report of the rightist connection to Oswald was not coming from a lone nut, but from agents of the national security system. Whether the information about Oswald was essentially correct or fabricated, it was informed in some detail. In my TFD piece on the Landesberg issue, I inferred that Landesberg had prior information noting that he had identified Oswald as a photographer, an occupation that doesn't naturally come to mind in association with the presidential assassin. Free association would concoct a violent persona. Nevertheless, I was wrong in thinking that information about Oswald's camera hobby was not publicly available immediately after the assassination. In fact, reviewing Times microfilm, I found it cited the day after the assassination on an inside page that reports on Oswald's application for a passport. Times reporter Edith Evans Asbury picked up on that consistency with the informant's story in her November 29, 1963 article, FBI checks reported Oswald rightist link, given the Times publication cycle. Oswald's self-identification as a photographer would have to have been released to the media no later than the day of the assassination. Okay, so just to point out that what they're talking about is on the application for the passport that was given in Los Angeles. That was issued September 10th, 1959, that has the photograph of the real Lee Harvey Oswald. So Harvey Oswald, if this is all possible, it's because Harvey Oswald is over in Soviet Union and the real Lee Oswald is in Greenwich Village. But that doesn't make sense that they would continue to use that same name. I would think they'd give him a different name at this point. But I was also mistaken in thinking that Landesberg did not report to the FBI until the day after the assassination. In fact, the FBI documents reveal he was also interviewed on the day of the assassination after he had begun spreading his Oswald rightist link story to various New York City media outlets. So he had virtually no time to fabricate a post-assassination story that would mesh with the information on Oswald's activities pouring into the news media in New York City that day. The photography angle just never sunk into my brain at that time, and I was reading the Times. Why should a chronic paranoid, as Landesberg was diagnosed, get details right? Another example, he managed to place the meeting of Oswald in the Marines in the summer of 1956. Oswald actually went to basic training that fall after turning 17. I know the Oswald timeline because I consulted the Warren Report using its index. Was it a lucky guess that within hours of the media spotlight on turning on Oswald, Landesberg picked up the right year of Oswald's enlistment, or was he remarkably able to distinguish fact from rumor in the news from Dallas before weaving them into a fabrication? Or was he prepped for his report, or were early and later versions of the story confounded, or did he simply know from the start? Placing Oswald in the Marines in 1956 fits the official bio of Oswald better than the FBI bio of Landesberg, who would only be 16 in the fall of 1956. I had guessed in my letter to Hewitt that Landesberg was born in 1936 rather than 1940. The other birth certificate dates applied by Armstrong, because the SS database shows that the L.A. Landesberg going on record in the 1952 to 1954 time slot, i.e. 12 to 14 years old, is rather young to be getting a job that required Social Security reporting. But I don't insist that the calculated guess. I don't insist on that calculated guess. And the 1940 date is consistent with the FBI interview of Landesberg's mother that put him in high school in 1956 and college in 1957. And the early enrollment is consistent with using the casual Steve rather than Stephen. But my notes from my phone conversation with John Armstrong has him saying that Landesberg was in the Marines in 1956. Was that another Landis? Hewitt's data does list a Stephen Landis, born 1138, who would have been just the right age to enlist for 1956 service after turning 17, and his SS enrollment in New York between 1957 and 59 is consistent with entering the civilian workforce later. His 3/193 Florida address is consistent with early retirement, but also with having moved to work there at some earlier date, and Landesberg did say before recanting that he again met Landis, ignoring spelling variations, in 1961 in Florida, where the latter was seeking work. Another dumb luck guess by the lone nut fabricator. The 1961 date for Florida is also consistent with someone who entered college in the New York area at the same time as Landesberg and left after the typical 4 years. Landesberg's early college affiliation is established in the FBI report from his mother's supplying Rutgers College directories for 1957, 58, and 60 listing Stephen H. Landis. So Landesberg could have known about a second Stephen Landis other than himself. It is significant that Landesberg's original story was told when he was speaking in the Rizzuto role. So even if the lines were essentially true, it is ambiguous whether the Landis he talked about being within the Marines and in Florida was himself or some others. Given that Landesberg provided proof of his connection to another Landis, he may have provided comparable proof of other Landis. Note that Landesberg is identified not only by a wrong social security number, but also by a military ID and a draft board ID. According to the FBI report, Landesberg presented a Marine military identification issued to S.H. Landis, abbreviation in the FBI report. But although the FBI records the Marine Corps serial number, it omits the date of issue and the date of expiration, rank at issue, and the issuing officer, items on my surviving military ID. The missing dates alone would allow a quick check on the timing aspect of the reported Oswald Landis link-up in the Marines, but the ID number would allow a thorough follow-up check on Landesberg. Note also that although the FBI reported that Landesberg had shortened his name to Landis in 1957, his 1940 birth year meant that he would not register with Selective Service until 1958, when he used his original Stephen Harris Landesberg name. Then we're to believe that later reverted to Landis in joining the Marines, and they allowed Stephen to shorten his first name to S for his ID. Was it Landesberg or the official record that acted odd? Because the FBI also recorded Landesberg's Selective Service number, investigators could check out whether the military and draft numbers reference the same person and much more. What they close to reveal to the news media is suspect. Okay, so this is just amazing because this harkens right back to the Alan R. Feld or Alexander D. Feld stuff that's going on with Oswald in the Marine Corps. It's like these guys had a bunch of first and last names, and then they all just shuffled them around whenever they needed to. Just like Sherman Cooley. Sherman Cooley is in the fucking Marines at Pendleton and basic training with Alan R. Feld and Lee Harvey Oswald. And so was Sherman Cooley. But Sherman Cooley is listed on the documents as Herbert Cooley. Herbert C. Cooley. So what the fuck, right? It's like a jumble of cards. All right. That Armstrong reports the actor Landesberg having so many different years of birth in his bios, 1936, 38, matching the New York, Florida Landis 40, 44, and 48, suggests that his different offstage roles may have produced different bios to fit the impersonations of real or imagined people, and all is suspect. So there are more issues to air, and I trust to be kept informed. Keep the info flowing. Carl. Interesting stuff, huh? All right, I'm going to keep going. A research note on Earl Perry by Stan Weber. Oh, no, this appears to be just more of the same. Yep. And notes there. All right, what is this? John Armstrong, Carol Hewitt, Sheldon Incoll, Carlton Sterling, and Jack White. Dear fellow researchers, this is my latest effort to make some sense out of the Landesberg case. If you'd like to comment on this draft, please do so. I am tentatively planning to send a revised version of this paper to Dr. Rose in mid-July. Respectfully, Stan Weber. All right, more on Stephen Landesberg. One of the most tangled evidentiary webs in the JFK case has been the one spun around Stephen H. Landis, a.k.a. Jim Rizzuto, a.k.a. Steve Leandis, and Stephen Harris Landesberg, a neo-Nazi who said he knew and associated with Lee Harvey Oswald in New York City in 1962. Several researchers have been working on this complex case, and their joint effort has generated some new information. The purpose of this paper is to report this new data and to interpret it in a manner that fits all of the available information that we have to date. The major revelation is that Landis lent his Social Security number to a German American in 1957, and that this is evidence of a genuine neo-Nazism on Landis' part, as opposed to play-acting a Nazi role as a form of personal surveillance upon the Nazi fringe. This is an important point because National Socialists were committed to cooperating with law enforcement. Consequently, there is a strong likelihood that Landis was an FBI informant who snitched on the Nazi crowd in Yorkville. Further, new evidence suggests that I don't agree with that at all. Further, new evidence suggests that Landis and Los Angeles actor-comedian Steve Landesberg are not the same person, although there is an intriguing and growing residual pool of circumstantial information that continues to point out similarities in the two men. Who is Stephen H. Landis? Landis was born Stephen Harris Landesberg on September 27, 1940, at Beth Israel Hospital in New York City. He attended Forest Hills High in the Queens, and after graduating in 1957, changed his name to Stephen H. Landis. Wonder why. He traveled the country that summer and then entered Rutgers University in the fall. During sophomore year, Landis, a Jew, was instrumental in establishing an integrated social fraternity at the school. His mother, Edna, described him during this time as a fighter for causes and an idealist. While in college, Stephen became increasingly critical of his parents and their way of life. Without revealing the ideology that guided Stephen's thoughts, his mother described him as very intolerant, believing that his views were right and everyone else was wrong. He claimed that he did not want to be conventional and that he was idealistic, sensitive, and artistic. He shocked his parents in February 1960 by dropping out of college because he was dissatisfied with his courses. He felt he did not know what he wanted to do and wanted an opportunity to think things out. He traveled to Florida with his roommate, where they parted. Landis worked his way west across the country, drifting and taking odd jobs until he had sufficient money to go to the next place. By summer, Stephen grew tired of traveling and returned to New York on July 13th. Back home, his attitude gradually deteriorated to one of dissatisfaction and criticism. He spent most of his time reading and going to the library. He did, on the recommendation of his parents, see 2 New York psychiatrists, but rejected their recommendations for continued psychotherapy. In late 1960, Stephen enlisted in the Marine Corps. He arrived at Parris Island Marine Base on January 25, 1961, and 6 days later was transferred to the psychiatric unit because of his bizarre and unusual behavior during recruit training. He refused to abide by any of the rules or regulations and insisted he knew what was best for him. The diagnosis was schizophrenic reaction. At this time in history of psychiatry, the diagnosis was considered to be a physical disability. This sounds staged. When interviewed by psychiatrists, Stephen admitted that he could be a voluminous writer of letters to newspapers when he felt that his rights had been violated, and had even attempted to see the president. He told doctors that he knew that he could kill someone. He knew if he hated them, and that the Marine Corps would give him an opportunity to see if he could kill people that he didn't know. Certain questions asked of Landis suggested that the psychiatrist questioned his sexual orientation and that they suspected him of being a homosexual. Jesus, how much of this looks like Oswald? How much of this looks just like Oswald? Man, was Oswald a hidden Jew too? In February 1961, he received an honorable discharge from the Marines and returned home, where he resided until June of 1961. Shortly after that time, he resided in his own apartment in the vicinity of East 84th Street in New York City. This is in Yorkville, the German section of New York that had been the national headquarters of the German-American Bund in the 30s and the rallying point of the early 60s Nazi fringe in the city. It is the place where Daniel Burroughs escaped after breaking off with George Rockwell and establishing his own American National Party. It was a small-town atmosphere, with Nazis joining each other's parties and then snitching about their rivals to the NYPD and other authorities. Because National Socialists believed in cooperating with law enforcement, the snitching was a badge of honor for them. I consider it a near certainty that Landis was informing for the FBI, given this tradition. His work resembles the Bureau's White Hat COINTELPRO, in which informants disrupted and fomented divisions within the Klan and kindred groups. Stephen lived at 165 East 49th Street from November 29, 1961 to February 8, 1962. This period of time coincided with his public exploits in Greenwich Village. He was known for his virulent pro-segregationism and anti-Semitism and his disruptive behavior at Jewish meetings and liberal rallies. I feel that his exposure to Yorkville played a role in this eruption of his Nazism, which he did not often reveal to the public. In September 1962, he returned to Rutgers University as a student. In September of 63, he was back in New York City attending Columbia University, where he was classified as a special student in general studies. At this time, he was very close to completing his degree. Researchers question whether the person described above is the man the FBI was looking for in Greenwich Village the week following the assassination. The Bureau scoured the village with a picture of a bearded man wearing a blue coat and a red scarf. I believe this was Landis. The scarf was Landis' trademark during the disruptions of 61 and 62. Landis and Joseph Wiersch. According to an analysis by Carol Hewitt, Landis received Social Security number 126303500 between 1955 and 1957. This is consistent with a young man born in 1940 entering the workforce. In 1958, a German-American by the name of Joseph Wiersch began using Landis' Social Security number. When Wiersch died in 1985, Social Security death records linked him to the Social Security number and was originally given to Landis. Wiersch's last residence was Mastic Beach, New York, which is in Suffolk County. As Carlton Sterling pointed out to me, Social Security numbers were more tightly held back in the early 60s than they are now, so the possibility of a duplicate number being assigned in error is remote. I believe Landis lent his number to Wiersch. This was in the tradition of the American neo-Nazis rendering assistance to Wehrmacht veterans and fellow travelers who immigrated to or resided in the U.S. Rosenthal and Gelb documented the hero worship that the former troopers received from the Yorkville crowd, and Daniel Burroughs' extraordinary efforts to secure a book contract for one of them. Lending a Social Security number to Wiersch falls within his tradition of rendering aid. Upon his arrest on December 5, 1963, Landis provided 2 pieces of information to the FBI that were, I believe, intended to protect Wiersch. He reverted to his birth surname, Stephen Harris Landesberg, and he gave his Social Security number 126303503. That is 1 digit off from the one he gave to Wiersch. Sterling believes this is significant. The 9th digit may be a marker of code of some kind to distinguish Stephen H. Landis from Wiersch, Landis and the Jews. The picture of Landis that emerges from the unredacted files supplied to me by John Armstrong is that of a man who kept his Nazism to himself, accepting the Greenwich Village events of 61 and 62, kept up a Jewish front by helping to establish the integrated fraternity at Rutgers. Covertly, he was lending his Social Security number to Wiersch and carefully watching Jews in New York City. When speaking to the FBI after the assassination as Jim Rizzuto, he gave the Bureau the names of 9 people who would know Stephen Landis. According to the Bureau file, all 9 claimed not to know Landis. I suspected that they were all Jews or left-wingers that Landis was monitoring. The first person on the list, Watt Espy, who Landis told the Bureau was a friend and fellow traveler of Landis, went on to become one of the most prominent criminologists in the United States. His database on American lynchings is considered the benchmark for such data. He wrote to me in April of 1998 that he had never met Stephen Landis to the best of his knowledge, nor does he remember being contacted by the FBI following the assassination. The search for Earl Perry. In Landis' original story to the FBI, he told of a close associate of Landis, and Oswald named Earl Perry. According to the story, Perry traveled to Europe and Russia at the same time Oswald did, and Perry and Oswald returned to New York by early 1962, where both men were seen at the American Jewish Congress meeting that Landis disrupted. Perry returned to Texas sometime during 1963 and by November had reunited with Oswald. John Armstrong found 2 FBI memos pertaining to Perry. The first is a report of Special Agent Reed's November 24, 1963 interview with Marine Lieutenant Colonel James Perry of El Paso. Mr. Perry said that his younger brother, Earl Perry, was stationed with the Marines in California in 1956. Earl left the Corps about 1957 and lived in Lubbock, Texas, from 57 to 60. He rejoined the Marines sometime in the early 1960s. This memo is vague about this date and was assigned to the helicopter repair parts unit in Okinawa, where he achieved the rank of sergeant. This Okinawa and helicopter repair is significant. Very significant. Earl Perry was expected to return to the United States in November or December 1963. The Pentagon would not release Perry's file because it was confidential. Perry having been involved in an assault on federal officer. As of April 1998, I've been unable to verify any of the details of James Perry's story. Whatever happened to Stephen Landis? At least two lines of thought have evolved to answer this question. First, I'll present my view that Landis returned to school, earned 2 degrees, and is now a prominent businessman who lives in New York and Boca Raton, Florida. The second line of thought is that Landis changed his name back to Landesberg and is now a comedian who lives in New York and Los Angeles. Scared straight by his hospitalization, I believe that Landis returned to Queens College to finish his degree and lay low, escaping his scrutiny of the Columbia Student Press Corps, including Carlton Sterling. He did return to Columbia to work on his MBA, which he received in 1967. He went on to work for a brokerage firm called Leff Associates, which became Fosterman Leff in the takeover mania of the 80s. At some point in time, I cannot pin down, Landis moved on to become the New York-based salesman for ladies' underwear manufacturer Rocky Mount Undergarment, based in North Carolina. He moved his family to Boca Raton in 1978. At the same time, he started a commuter lifestyle, traveling to Florida on weekends and staying in a rented Manhattan apartment during the week. He met with some success in the underwear business, becoming an officer of the Rocky Mount Undergarment. Ever since founding an association of airline commuters in South Florida after Eastern Airlines went out of business, he had become a favorite of journalists, being quoted often in stories having to do with long-distance commuting. Most researchers, however, suspect that Landis really resurfaced in the late 60s as a comedian who wowed the village and in 1971 appeared on The Tonight Show, the nation dropping the formal Stephen for the more casual Steve and reuniting with his birth surname. He landed a job on Barney Miller and almost allowed him to play himself. After that, it was on the radio and television commercials, and most recently the cable TV series. There's a psychiatric undertone to Stephen Landesberg's comedy called Wacko Comedy by Johnny Carson in 1971. Landesberg's off-the-wall appearance on Tonight led to one of his first substantial TV roles as a Viennese psychiatrist. Such small bit parts led to the audition for Barney Miller, and a career was born. The role of the over-intellectualized detective Dietrich appeared Taylor made for Landesberg's personality, and the character's rambling, loosely connected commentary on contemporary events seemed consistent with schizophrenia in remission. And in his most recent job, he plays a judge, shades of Judge Cannella. Landesberg continues to be vague about his age. He now supplies biographers with a birth year, but it is always incorrect. This dishonesty only fuels suspicion among researchers that Landesberg has much more to hide than his age. When confronted by Jack White and John Armstrong with the newspaper clippings linking a Stephen Landesberg to Oswald, the comedian refused to comment, and his security officer Tom Walker threatened both White and Armstrong. Landesberg's legendary ability to produce a convincing Southern accent is one of his comedic trademarks. The Stephen Landis who presented himself as Rizzuto had precisely the same skill, as attested by Village Voice reporters who knew Landis when he was wreaking havoc near NYU and then later covered the post-assassination story of Rizzuto. Comedian Landesberg is an avid New York Yankees fan whose devotion to the team borders on fanaticism. The star of his very forgettable 1987 Grade B movie, Leader of the Band, was a character named Eddie Layton, who also was the name of the legend who played organ at Yankee Stadium. To biographers, Landesberg claimed that his fanaticism was due to his close proximity to the stadium, having grown up a stone's throw away in the Bronx. Assassination researchers suspect the Greenwich Village hoaxer was similarly preoccupied with the Yankees. Witness the fake name uttered on November 22nd, Rizzuto, one of the all-time great Yankee players and broadcasters and friend of the comedian. Then, too, two important surnames or pseudonyms blurted out by the hoaxer on the morning of November 23rd have baseball connections. The Regan that Stephen Landis supposedly met at the Hotel Roosevelt, as well as the close friend Perry, happened to be the last names of two prominent American League pitchers that plied their skills against the Bronx Bombers in the early 60s. Even the comedian's ideology has shown flashes of similarity with Landis's neo-Nazism. Something tells me it's fake neo-Nazism, Jewish fake neo-Nazism. Extremist watchers at Michigan State were so alarmed at his racist, anti-Semitic 1978 appearance on the John Davidson Show that they started an extremist file on him. Convincing as the above circumstantial evidence may be to researchers, I object to the idea that the comedian was Oswald's friend, based on the birth certificate and Social Security evidence. There are two Landesbergs with two birth certificates. One, a Bronx certificate, indicates a 1936 birth date, And this meshes well with Hewitt's Social Security analysis, which showed a Stephen Landesberg getting his number between 52 and 54. Then later reporting various New York and Los Angeles addresses. This is the comedian. The second birth certificate is a Manhattan certificate confirmed by the New York Times birth announcement of September 29, 1940. There are at least 2 Social Security numbers that can be tracked back to this person, whom I believe is Stephen Landis. I have explained the discrepancy by suggesting that Landis lent his first number to Wiersch and then obtained a second for personal use. All right. That is probably going to wrap this up, with the rest of this being like some notes. Yep, it's exactly what it is. So the thing is, this story is obviously drenched in the waters of intelligence, right? People just don't go around with these fake numbers and supporting Nazis and they're Jewish and they do agitation. No. This is organized agitation. This is additional identity transfer stuff. And this provides more backing to the concept that identity transfer is a normal thing for the intelligence guys. So that's going to do it for me today, guys. I would really appreciate it if you go pick up my new book, Lee Harvey Oswald in Black and White. It's on Amazon. It kicks ass, and you should have it in your collection. And that's going to do it for me today, guys. I appreciate you tuning in, and I'll be back tomorrow with something.